11 seasons, over 250 episodes. A finale that still holds the record for the most-watched television broadcast in American history. And yet, almost none of the actors who started this show were still there when it ended. Some walked away at the height of their fame. Some were quietly written out with no goodbye at all. And one departure was so shocking that it changed the way television handled death forever. Today we're digging into why the cast of MASH really left, one actor at a time, and the truth is a lot messier than most fans realize. Before we get into the departures, it helps to understand what MASH actually was, because it wasn't a normal sitcom, and that's exactly why it chewed through its cast the way it did. The show is based on a 1968 novel by Richard Hooker, a pen name for a real Korean War army surgeon, and it was adapted into a film by Robert Altman in 1970 before CBS turned it into a weekly series 2 years later. When it premiered in September of 1972, it was airing during the final, exhausting years of the Vietnam War, even though it was technically set 2 decades earlier during Korea. That gap between setting and reality gave the writers enormous freedom. They could talk about the horror of war, the absurdity of military bureaucracy, and the toll it takes on ordinary people, all while wrapping it in comedy so it would slide past network censors and straight into people's living rooms. The show almost didn't survive its first year. Ratings were weak enough that cancellation was a real possibility until CBS moved it to a new night, and it slowly built into one of the most watched programs in the country.
As it grew, it also changed.
What started as a fairly broad ensemble comedy, closer in tone to the movie, gradually became something more serialized and more emotional, largely because Alan Alda, who played Hawkeye Pierce, became more and more involved behind the camera as a writer and director. That shift mattered, because it meant some actors found their characters growing richer over time, while others found themselves standing still while the show moved on without them. That single dynamic explains almost every major exit on this list. Let's start with the departure that people still talk about first, because it's the one that actually rewired how American television dealt with death on screen. McLean Stevenson played Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, the genuinely confused commanding officer of the 4077th. He wasn't sharp like Hawkeye or scheming like Frank Burns. He was warm, a little clueless, and mostly just trying to keep his hospital running without anyone noticing he was in over his head. Audiences loved him for it, and Stevenson even won a Golden Globe for the role in the show's early years. But behind the scenes, he wasn't satisfied. As the show increasingly centered on Hawkeye, Stevenson felt his character sliding into the background, and he had bigger ambitions than playing a supporting player forever. He wanted to lead his own show, to be the name at the top of the call sheet rather than the guy propping up somebody else's story. By the end of season 3, he told the producers he was done, and rather than write Henry Blake off in the usual sitcom fashion, with a promotion or a transfer or a wedding, the writers decided to do something almost nobody had tried before. In the closing minutes of the episode Abyssinia, Henry, after an entire episode spent celebrating Henry finally getting to go home, Radar walks into the operating room and reads a message stating that Blake's plane went down over the Sea of Japan with no survivors. There's no music, no laugh track, just silence and the sound of surgical equipment. Most of the cast had no idea that was coming, so what audiences saw was genuine shock, not acting. It became one of the most talked about moments in television history, and it told viewers, in no uncertain terms, that this show was willing to treat war as something that actually kills people, even beloved ones. For Stevenson personally, the story afterward is a little bittersweet. He signed a new deal and starred in his own sitcom, which was canceled quickly, and then in another one that fared even worse. In later interviews, he acknowledged that leaving MASH had been a mistake, admitting that he had underestimated just how rare that particular combination of cast, writing, and timing really was. He continued working steadily in television for years afterward, but he never found another role that connected with audiences the way Henry Blake did. When he passed away in 1996, colleagues from the show spoke warmly of him, remembering both his talent and his generosity, even though his exit had once been the most controversial thing to happen on the series. If Stevenson's departure was loud, dramatic, and unforgettable, Wayne Rogers' exit was almost the exact opposite, and in some ways that made it even stranger. Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, Hawkeye's partner in crime for the first 3 seasons, the two of them functioning almost like a comedy duo built around banter, mischief, and a shared disdain for military nonsense. The chemistry worked, and early MASH leaned heavily on that pairing. But Rogers had signed on believing the show would function as a true ensemble, with the cast sharing the spotlight fairly evenly. As Alda's role expanded, and the writing started orbiting around Hawkeye specifically, Rogers watched his own character shrink into someone who mostly reacted to what Hawkeye did rather than driving scenes of his own. He later said, in essence, that Trapper had gone from being one of 2 lead characters to being the guy who just agreed with everything Hawkeye said, and that this wasn't about vanity so much as frustration at watching a character with real potential get flattened. Rather than negotiate or make a public case for a better deal, Rogers simply chose not to return for season 4, and he did it quietly. Adding to the strangeness of the whole situation, it turned out Rogers had actually never signed a formal contract for the show. He had been working the entire time on a handshake agreement, which meant that when producers considered legal action over his departure, they had no real ground to stand on. He had broken nothing because there was nothing on paper to break. His exit left the production scrambling. There was no farewell episode, no emotional send-off, just a brief line early in season 4 explaining that Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye happened to be away. Mike Farrell was brought in shortly after as BJ Honeycutt, a calmer, more settled family man who gave the show a very different energy than Trapper's restless troublemaking. Rogers went on to have a long career, including television and film roles, but he eventually built an entirely separate life as a financial investor, studying at Princeton and later becoming a recognizable voice on business television discussing markets and economics. Despite the abruptness of his exit, he and Alda apparently stayed on good terms for decades, with Alda later describing him as one of the sharpest people he'd ever worked with. Rogers passed away in 2015, and it's worth noting that even though his MASH run was short compared to most of the cast, Trapper John remains one of the show's most fondly remembered characters. Not every departure was about ambition or ego, though. Some of them were about something a lot heavier, and Gary Berghoff's exit is probably the clearest example of that on this list. Berghoff played Radar O'Reilly, the young company clerk with an almost supernatural ability to sense incoming helicopters and orders before anyone told him about them. He was the only actor to carry his role over directly from the original 1970 film, and on television, he shaped Radar into something gentler and more vulnerable than the character had been on the big screen, turning him into a kind of emotional barometer for the whole unit. Radar's innocence made the war around him feel even more brutal by contrast, and that made him one of the most beloved characters on the show. But behind that performance, Berghoff was reportedly struggling. The demands of a grueling production schedule combined with real personal difficulties, including periods of anxiety and depression that were rarely discussed publicly at the time, wore on him as the seasons went by. He also had a young family, and he later spoke about how much he regretted the time away from his daughter during those early years, describing it as a decision he never stopped feeling conflicted about. On top of the emotional toll, there were practical contract disputes as well, with Berghoff pushing for better pay and reduced screen time, so he could have more of a personal life, and producers trying to accommodate him as much as they reasonably could given how central Radar had become to the show. Eventually, none of those adjustments were enough, and by season 8, Berghoff decided it was time to leave for good. Unlike Rogers, Berghoff was given a proper send-off, a 2-part episode called Goodbye, Radar, which is still considered one of the more emotional arcs in the series. In it, Radar returns from leave to find the unit falling apart without him, tries briefly to fix everything the way he always had, and ultimately realizes that it's time to go home and take care of his family and his farm. The final image, Radar walking away with his teddy bear left behind, closed out one of the show's gentlest and most human characters with real tenderness. After MASH, Berghoff largely stepped back from the industry. He appeared in a short-lived spin-off, tried a few other projects, and then moved toward painting, wildlife conservation, and inventing, eventually holding patents related to fishing equipment. In interviews since then, he's described leaving as a combination of exhaustion and a genuine need to reconnect with his family, a decision that, whatever it cost his career, seems to have given him the life he actually wanted. Then there's Larry Linville, whose departure is a good example of an actor recognizing that his character had run out of road. Linville played Major Frank Burns, the rigid, rule-obsessed, secretly insecure rival to Hawkeye and Trapper, a character defined by his affair with Major Houlihan and his constant, petty attempts to enforce discipline nobody respected. Frank worked wonderfully as a comic foil in the show's earlier, broader seasons, but as MASH matured into something more emotionally complex, Frank largely stayed exactly the same. His flaws never evolved into anything more layered, which was by design, but it also meant Linville, an actor capable of more range than the role allowed, had less and less to do dramatically as the years went on. By the end of season 5, he chose not to renew his contract, later explaining that he felt he had taken the character about as far as it could reasonably go. His exit wasn't dramatized on screen in any major way. Frank was simply written out as having received an unearned promotion and transfer, a fittingly deflating exit for a character who never got the respect he thought he deserved. Losing Frank actually gave the writers room to deepen the show's moral texture, since they no longer needed a cartoonish villain to generate easy conflict. Linville continued working steadily afterward in television and film, though he never landed another role with quite the same visibility as Frank Burns. Frank's replacement brings us to David Ogden Stiers, whose MASH story is different from everyone else's on this list because he didn't really leave under pressure at all. He simply stayed until the story was finished. Stiers joined in season 6 as Major Charles Emerson Winchester III, a wealthy, cultured Bostonian who was introduced partly to fill the gap Frank Burns left behind. Winchester was arrogant and condescending in his early appearances, but the writers spent years slowly cracking that shell, revealing a man who was guarded rather than heartless, and who was, like everyone else at the 4077th, quietly being worn down by the war around him. Stiers played that slow reveal with a lot of restraint, and by the time the series ended, Winchester had become one of its more surprisingly moving characters, closing out his arc in the finale by teaching a group of Chinese prisoners of war to play music, a scene widely regarded as one of the most quietly powerful moments in the entire series. When the short-lived spin-off after MASH was being put together, Stiers reportedly chose not to join, feeling that Winchester's story had already been told in full and it didn't need to continue. After MASH, he built a long career doing voice work, including for several well-known animated films, and later in his life, he spoke publicly about his identity, saying he hadn't felt able to do so earlier in his career out of concern that it might limit the roles he was offered, a concern that reflected real industry attitudes at the time rather than anything specific to MASH itself. He continued working steadily until his passing in 2018, remembered by colleagues for both his skill as a performer and the dignity with which he eventually lived more openly. It's worth pausing here to talk about the actors who didn't leave, because their staying power says just as much about the show as anyone's departure. Loretta Swit, who played Major Margaret Houlihan, is the clearest example. When the series began, Margaret was written mostly as comic relief, defined largely by an old nickname referencing a joke from the original film. Swit spent years pushing to give the character more depth, and over the course of the show Margaret grew into a skilled, respected head nurse who was allowed to be strong, flawed, and openly critical of the war, while still doing her job with total professionalism. Swit was one of only a small handful of actors to appear in both the very first episode and the very last, and her persistence in reshaping Margaret is a big part of why the character is remembered so fondly today, rather than as the one-note gag she started out as. Looking at all of these departures together, a pattern starts to emerge that has less to do with drama or scandal and more to do with the simple mechanics of a long-running show evolving over time. Some actors, like Stevenson and Rogers, left because they felt the show's growing focus on Hawkeye was squeezing their characters out of the spotlight, and both of them wanted more creative control over their own careers than a supporting role could offer. Others, like Berghoff, left for deeply personal reasons that had nothing to do with vanity or competition, choosing family and mental health over continued fame. Linville left because his character had essentially completed its purpose within the show's structure, and staying longer wouldn't have added anything meaningful. And Stiers represents the other end of that spectrum entirely, an actor who stayed precisely because his character still had somewhere left to go. What's striking, looking back at all of this, is that none of these exits actually damaged the show in the way you might expect. If anything, MASH used almost every major departure as an opportunity to push itself further, becoming more serious, more character-driven, and more willing to sit with uncomfortable truths about war as the years went on. Losing Henry Blake let the writers show, in the bluntest way possible, that this was never just a comedy about doctors making jokes in a war zone. Losing Trapper John opened space for a quieter, more grounded version of that friendship with BJ. Losing Frank Burns allowed the moral conflicts on the show to grow more nuanced than a simple hero versus villain setup. And keeping characters like Margaret and Winchester around long enough to let them fully develop gave the later seasons an emotional weight the early years hadn't quite reached yet. In the end, that's probably the real reason MASH is still remembered so vividly more than 4 decades after it ended. It wasn't a show that stayed the same for 11 years with the same cast delivering the same jokes. It was a show that kept changing, sometimes because the writers wanted it to, and sometimes because the people playing these characters needed something the show couldn't give them anymore. Every departure on this list, whether it was loud and shocking or quiet and unremarked, forced the series to grow in a slightly different direction, and somehow, against fairly long odds, it kept getting better instead of falling apart. That's a rare thing for any long-running show to pull off, and it's a big part of why MASH still holds up the way it does today. If you want to see us break down more of the behind-the-scenes stories from classic television, let us know in the comments which show you'd like covered next, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.